Chapter 9. Departure. Needless to say, there was quite the hubbub in Ur after the fire. Nimrod ordered Abram to be clothed and taken at once to the palace. He and the nobles of the court gave him gifts of silver and gold, as if to placate him from doing some great evil to them in payment for how they had treated him. Nimrod himself gave him 2 servants from his own personal retinue to serve as Abram's personal servants, Oni and Eliezer. "These are no mean servants, my lord," Nimrod said to Abram, speaking with respect. "Eliezer here is from Damascus, the wild lands of the south, and knows the tongue of the barbarians of the wilderness." The reaction from Abram's family was less than stellar. Terah and Amphilo would not speak to him. Though he had survived, they were still grief-stricken for the loss of Haran. Terah blamed Abram for this, refusing to accept the responsibility for his own lies. As for Amphilo, the grief at having to watch her own son die a slow death in fire was too much for her old body. On the other hand, Nahor was a little more reasonable. He at least embraced Abram when they were reunited in the king's palace, eager to see if he was flesh and blood. But he said nothing else. Haran was his brother, and he had his own private reservations for him. As for Haran's children, their reaction was varied. Lot was now the heir of his father's wealth, and gave the warmest welcome to Abram. In his mind, if he was good to Abram, then perhaps he would be blessed as well, and good things would happen to him. Milcah smiled and gave a respectful nod to Abram, despite being sad at the death of her father. As for Sarai, she seemed wholly unable to look him in the eyes, though she did not express openly any sorrow or bitterness. There was yet something else that was on her mind, that drove her to avert her eyes from the old man and his warm, dark brown eyes. In the days and weeks that followed, the house of Terah became a favorite stopping place for curiosity seekers, and those who longed merely to catch a glimpse of the man who had escaped the fire. They were enraptured by the awe of the spectacle, and so wished to see him. As many as visited him, Abram told every one of them about the eternal God. No one he denied, whether young or old, rich or poor, free man or slave, man or woman. Terah was quite frustrated with this, for he did not see it as appropriate for so many strangers to be coming in and out of his house, especially women. Abram was still unmarried, and there were laws of propriety in those days. Therefore, Abram was obliged to stand in the courtyard of the house in order to share the good news with his guests. Many of them were merely there to see the one who had escaped the fire, and would not listen to his words about the eternal God. But there were some who listened. As he was Abram's servant, and therefore under the rule of his master, Eliezer was among the first to accept the Eternal as his God. He watched Abram and did as he was told, and for the present, that was enough. He was always wary of Lot, whom he said only followed Abram's God for personal gain. Though he only said it once, and when Abram scolded him for speaking against family, he would not say so again. He would also accompany Abram as he went about the city, and spoke to those in the marketplaces about the eternal God. He was most impressed when Abram met an old woman in the marketplace, whose house had been ransacked, and a golden image, given to her by Haran, had been stolen from it. Abram very politely told her that it was silly to pay homage to something that could be stolen by thieves and had no power to save itself. In this, Abram had opportunity to share the truth of the eternal God to her, and won her over to his side. Within a few months' time, no fewer than 300 people of Ur were now worshippers of the eternal God, whether in private or in public. Among them was Sharum, the captain of the king's prison. It was about this time that Amphilo died, and was interred in a grave of mud bricks outside the city. She was buried on her side, with legs curled close to the body, as though sleeping. In addition, 2 heifers were brought to the graveside, their throats slit and their remains buried with her. When the sorry proceedings were done, and the mourners paid for, Terah called his sons together, including Abram. It is time now to give consideration to the daughters of my son, he said. I would prefer to have them marry in the family and not be given to strangers or foreign barbarians. He sighed and turned to Abram. The eldest, Sarai, I would give to you, Abram, and the younger, Milcah, to you, Nahor. What do they think about this matter? Abram asked. Terah looked oddly at him. Oh yes, I'd forgotten. You were raised by shepherds in the wilderness and know nothing of our ways. I am their Lord Father, and they are my children. They serve me as we serve the king. Perhaps, he sighed, perhaps when you are your own master, you will understand. Abram was pleased with this, though he was worried about what Sarai felt. She had been secluded from him throughout the months since the fire, and hadn't sought him out or sent word to him at all. He feared that she was still sad about the death of her father, his brother Haran. He wondered what had become of him, for he hadn't seen his burial site, and wondered why it wasn't here next to his mother Amthalo. After he had agreed to this, he went back to the house of Terah, and had Eliezer summon Sarai to him. It was still awkward to have servants at his beck and call, but he could certainly grow used to it. That evening, as he remained in his room and prayed, there was a knock at the door. From behind, he heard the voice of his servant. My lord, Eliezer said, the lady Sarai is here, as you requested. Thank you, Eliezer, Abram replied. Let her in, then leave us be until I call for you. The door opened, and Sarai entered the room. She was dressed as she had been the day they first met, though her eyes were turned to the ground as she spoke. I have heard from my lord Terah that we are to be married, she said. The eternal God smiles upon his servant, Abram stated. Does this meet with your approval? She asked. It does, Abram said. Does it suit with your approval? There is no need to ask me what I think, my lord, Sarai stated. If it is my grandfather's wish that we are married, then I shall oblige him. Just the same, Abram returned. Oblige me. Tell me how you feel on this matter. At this, Sarai looked up at Abram with her dark, coal-lined eyes. My heart is torn, my lord, Sarai began, between what I have been told all my life and the stories of a wild-haired shepherd from the wilderness. Is there something I've done to anger you? Abram asked. My father is dead because of you, Sarai continued. I should hate you with every fiber of my being. If you're angry with me, you don't have to marry me, Abram assured her. Oh, don't fill my head with such wild fantasies, Sarai sighed, averting her gaze and raising her hand to her eyes. It would be shame to reject my grandfather's wishes, to him and to me. It is his wish that we do not marry outside the family. And since my brother Lot is already married, you are the one I must marry. She sniffled softly, and Abram reached out to place a comforting hand on her shoulder. She gently shuffled him away. Still, there is something about you that I cannot force from my mind, no matter how much I would like to. She turned to Abram, and he saw her dark eyes brimming with tears. I saw my father die before my eyes, while you, my lord, were spared. It was an impossible thing. The eternal God spared my life. Sarai sighed. You stand there in your bearded defiance, so sure in your faith. But for me, more than my father died that day. The Ur-Khaldim burned with him in that fire. All my life, my father told me to honor the gods, to reverence the gods, to fear the gods, to bow down and pay homage to the gods. And for all of that, they did nothing to save him. And here you come out of the wilderness with your defiance of the king, of his gods, of my father's gods, and you were saved from the same fire that destroyed my father. And what would you have? Abram asked. That you had never come into my life and made my life so complicated. Need it be complicated? How can I reconcile the power of your God and not dishonor my father? There is no dishonor in that. Before he died, your father Haran confessed that he recognized the eternal God. Then why was he not saved? I don't know. But is there not something that you can do for your father? What is that? Sarai asked. He accepted the eternal God in the end, Abram said. As his daughter, you carry his blood with you. Live for him and follow the eternal God for him, that his memory will live on in you and not be ashamed. Sarai raised her hand and struck Abram across the face, and balled her hands into fists and smote his chest. Yet he remained resolute. The last vestige of her resistance faded. She buried her face in his chest, sobbing uncontrollably. Abram placed his arms around her to comfort her, and she sighed. Oh, how I wish you were an ignorant shepherd. She wept. No one has ever given me what you now offer. She sighed for a moment, then looked up into Abram's eyes. You ask me what I would have if I had my way? She asked. I will do as my grandfather says and marry you, so that I may know more from you about this God of yours. Abram rested his head upon the top of Sarai's and kissed her hair. In time, there were 2 weddings in the house of Terah. Abram married Sarai, and Nahor married Milcah. The wedding feast was filled with many friends, more than could be seated in the house of Terah. For all of Abram's friends that he had made who worshipped the Eternal were there for him as well. It was indeed a happy time, and Abram felt as though he had at last been given his heart's desire. For he had a family, a house, servants, expensive gifts from the king as financial wealth, as well as a portion of his father's flocks as physical wealth, a wife, and a small gathering of people he had managed to convert to the true faith. What more could he ask for? For the space of about 2 years, there was a time of peace in the kingdom. Nimrod ignored Abram for as long as the memory of the fire remained in his mind. Even when it grew dim, he did not openly wage war against him. He had made a rather public display of giving him gifts indicating his favor to him, and it would be a shame and dishonor to destroy him now. For the present, business in the south was his chief concern. In preparation for a military campaign into the south, he had a great temple dedicated to Chaldees and his consort Arubani, built in the city of Baalbek. It was to stand as a testimony to his power, and the authority of his gods, over the earth and sky gods of the barbaric Amorites, and the much wealthier folk in the Jordan Valley farther to the south. One day, while at court, he was busy poring over the maps of the land of Canaan and floor plans for his great temple. It would require 100 giants to move the colossal stones that would serve as the foundation for his temple. As fate would have it, the Amorites were reportedly very tall themselves. More than this, they were whispers of other giants dwelling in the hills and mountains east of the river Jordan. Perhaps he would prepare a military campaign into Canaan with his son Amraphel and as his lieutenant, and subdue the giants to have them build his temple. It would serve as a prime example of his power over these people. As he listened to what his advisors were droning on about, Nimrod's eyes grew heavy, and he rested his chin upon his fist. Suddenly, into his vision, he saw himself standing in the pavilion where the furnace that had become a pool stood. He looked this way and that for the throne room and saw a host of his armies standing behind him. Turning in front of him, he saw the pool had become a blaze of fire again. Out of the fire there strode Abram, a sword in his hand. A certainty came into Nimrod's mind that the son of Terah meant to do him harm. His knees quaked and he stumbled backwards among the companies of his troops. Then, to his horror, he saw that Abram remove something from his robe, the egg of a bird. With this in his hand, he threw it into the midst of Nimrod's hosts. Before the king's eyes, another marvelous thing happened. When the egg struck the king's forehead, it burst into a great flood and swept up the soldiers of his companies around him. There were now none to save him from the old man with the sword in his hand. Nimrod turned to run, drenched and soaked as he was, and run he did. As he ran, he saw that 3 others from his retinue had escaped the flood, and were sloshing and splashing with him away from the old man and the flood. Then suddenly, as the flood had appeared, it vanished, and there was nothing but a single egg lying on the ground. For a moment they paused, feeling safe from the assault. They were, after all, 4 princes, and he was but one man. Then, another miraculous thing happened. The egg cracked open, and a young bird of red feathers flew out from amid the shell. It descended upon Nimrod, and gouged out his eye with its beak. Nimrod was crying with a loud voice, as if in great pain, and swatting at the air, trying to scare away the little bird in vain. Yet he was not blind, but merely dreaming. Before all his courtiers they saw the king, as if mad, crying and flailing about on his throne, swatting the air. As he flailed and rocked about, his chair leaned forward and he fell out of his throne. The guards and the courtiers rushed to the king's side, holding him up from crashing to the ground. In their arms he at last awoke, and realized it was all a dream. Angrily, or perhaps in terror at what had happened, he pushed away his attendants, gasping in terror as he passed his hands over his eyes. Anuki, the king's chief advisor and astrologer, hadn't leapt to help the king when he fell. But now he approached to ask Nimrod what he had seen, guessing that he had been in the midst of a dream. After a brief respite, to catch his breath and regain control of his wits, Nimrod at last told what he had dreamed. Without leaping into the usual trances or maddening dance and howling to the Ur-Khaldim, Anuki had an answer for the king immediately. "Your Majesty," he began, "it has been 52 years since your humble servant saw the evil star that foretold the birth of this Abram. Now this dream has come to you as a warning. The seed of this man Abram shall surely make war with you, and of his line shall come one who shall slay you yourself, my king." "But, your Majesty," the voice of Terah spoke up from among the throng of attendants, "your son's servant is without children. His wife is barren." All eyes turned towards Terah. The fact of Sarai's barrenness was usually a closely held family secret. To be barren was considered a great curse upon a household. He would have no children to carry on his name after his death, no helping hands to do his father's work, which meant life or death for those who were extremely poor. And as for the woman, it was great shame to be unable to fulfill her office as a mother in a time when children were a sign of wealth and blessing. For the past 2 years, the news of Sarai's barrenness had been kept rather quiet. That Terah had revealed their secret to the king so readily demonstrated how much higher regard he gave to his place in the court of Nimrod than to his own son. But this time, the king would not be sated. "Do you think us a fool, Terah? Can Abram not adopt a son into his own household, or breed a son from among his handmaidens and claim it as his own?" "But, your Majesty," Terah continued, "remember how his God saved him from the fire." "Then we shall not bother with fire," Nimrod retorted. "We shall send at once to your house and have him brought to us at once for the slaughter, as should have been done 52 years ago." But even as this doom was pronounced, there was one in the court whose ears had heard everything that was said, who was friendly to Abram. Eliezer had been with Terah in the court of Nimrod that day. At his insistence, he had requested that he attend with his master's father in the king's court, and hear where the king's humors were regarding Abram. For most of the past 2 years, nothing of any note had happened, either for or against Abram. Until now. When Terah, aghast with the terrible doom that had now been pronounced upon his progeny, left the court, Eliezer approached him. "My lord," he said, "for the love of my master, why did you not defend my master before the king?" "Be silent," Terah snapped. "It is not your place to question me or my decisions." "Even if it means the death of my lord, your son?" Terah turned about and raised his hand as if he would strike Eliezer. He did not flinch, but stood as if he welcomed the blow, if it were in the name of his master. The old man's hand quivered as he looked at the servant, thoughts coming to his mind on what he himself had been willing to do 52 years ago. Instead of strike, he grabbed Eliezer by the braid of his long dark hair, dragged him aside behind a tapestry and into a hallway that led away from the main chamber. "Do you think I care not for the life of my son?" Terah asked. "Of course I do. But I must think also about our family and the consequences of incurring the king's wrath." "What would you do, my lord?" Eliezer asked. "Leave your son and heir to die?" Terah shushed the servant. "Shh! Be quiet! We must not let our business be known. Go back to the estate and get everyone ready for a journey. They will know what to do. What about you, my lord?" "I will attempt to buy us time with the king. I will return to the estate and let you know how it goes. Now make haste! Do not delay!" Eliezer nodded and made his way out of the palace as swiftly as possible, making sure to slow down and appear as inconspicuous in the presence of anyone who might know him and be suspicious of his haste. Once he was out of the palace grounds, he took off at a breakneck pace, disappearing into the crowds as soon as possible. Through the bustling, busy streets of Ur he went, keeping fresh in mind the swiftest direction back to Terah's estate. Eliezer ran. He was almost certain that he would be too late, and that the soldiers of Nimrod would be at the estate already, if not the Redcloaks as well. At last, Eliezer came to the outside of Terah's mansion. He paused for a moment to take wind and heave a heavy sigh of relief. The Redcloaks weren't there, and there was no sound of the king's soldiers marching on their way. It seemed he had made good time and gotten ahead of anyone else. Immediately he rushed inside and began calling out for Abram at the top of his lungs. To his surprise, Abram didn't answer him all at once. Instead, the other servants began gathering about him. The first of the lords who appeared was Lot, who came out of his room with his wife Ado. "What's all the noise about?" "We're leaving," Eliezer replied. "Your Lord Terah orders it. Where is my lord?" My lord uncle is visiting his disciples. What is this all about? I must find him. You must know before they find him. They? Who's they?" "The king's soldiers. They want my lord Abram dead." "What? Whatever for?" "Apologies, my lord, but I must warn the others. If you see the lady Sarai, warn her as well." Eliezer took off again, ignoring Lot's protests of having a servant order him around. Through the house he went, seeking out any servant he could find and ordering them to get ready to depart. Within moments, the whole house was stirred up like a kicked bee's hive. The servants began the difficult process of packing food and provisions and readying the animals for departure, most of them camels, either the long-haired variety native to this land, or the short-haired variety that roamed in the wild and barbaric lands of the south. These could bear great loads, and so were used as pack animals by the servants as they prepared for their journey. Once the house of Terah was set about packing, Eliezer went to find Abram. Having been with him on several of his missions of instruction and teaching, he knew the houses of those who were Abram's friends, or disciples as Lot had called them. Eliezer came to the first house and asked for Abram, but he was not there. Without staying to ask questions, Eliezer went towards the next house and inquired for his master. Again and again he went, unaware of the small crowd of Abram's friends and converts, curious as to the matter, following him. Little by little, by and by, and house by house, the crowd started to grow larger. At last, at the fifth house, Eliezer knocked at the door, and it was opened. There, in the midst of the doorway, surrounded by those who had come to listen, was Abram. "Eliezer," he greeted, "what brings you here in such a rush?" "The king!" Eliezer gasped. "He seeks your life. We have to leave." A hush fell upon the crowd, scattered with furtive whispers and cries of alarm. Abram rose from his seat, turning to Eliezer with a look of curiosity in his eyes. "Why does the king want my life?" Abram asked. "What have I done to him?" "There's no time," Eliezer replied. "Your lord father asks that you come back to the mansion and prepare to leave." "But I cannot abandon this flock," Abram said, gesturing to those around him. "There are still many who have yet to hear about the Eternal." "Would the Eternal be served by your death?" Eliezer asked. "He saved me from the fire," Abram replied. "Will he not save me from Nimrod again?" "Abram," one of the men from the house said, standing up, "if there is need for you to leave Ur, and we will go with you. No, I cannot ask you to leave your homes and your families behind on my account. You have shown us the eternal God. For you, we will go wherever you go. Why should we be parted from the one who has shown us the truth?" "No," Abram dismissed. "You are people. You have your own lives ahead of you. I cannot ask you all to abandon all of this for me. "There is no need to ask us, my lord," the man said, taking a knee. "We will serve you, and go wherever you go." Suddenly, with one accord, all those in the house, as well as those lingering just outside the door, kneeled before Abram. Even Eliezer took a knee, gasping and panting as he was. As for the son of Terah, he hesitated, looking into the eyes of all those around him. They were all looking up at him, eagerly, waiting for him to make an answer, to give them the word. He turned back to Eliezer, catching his breath but looking up at his master, waiting for new orders. At last, Abram sighed and turned towards the door. "Prepare yourselves. We leave as soon as we're ready." Eliezer brought Abram back to the house of Terah, while the people followed on behind him. Word spread like wildfire to the rest of the houses where Abram's friends dwelt. They packed up their things, as many as they could carry on their backs or in their arms, and left their houses, going to Terah's mansion in small groups no larger than 10 people. Some of the men who were strong enough to wield a staff made a small perimeter around the mansion, for all the good it would do them against the red cloaks with bronze swords, spears, and axes. The last one to enter the house before the perimeter was closed was Terah, who was hurrying back to the house with a worried look on his face. In the center of the mansion's courtyard, the nobles of the house gathered about with Eliezer standing behind Abram, with his head lowered in respect. Among those gathered were Lot and Ado, Nahor and Milcah, and Abram and Sarai. Terah arrived at last, muttering to himself and looking at the ground as though in shame. All eyes turned to him as soon as his presence was known. He raised his head, turned to Abram, looking on his son with sorrow in his eyes, and shook his head. "I've done all that I could do," Terah said, "but the king will not be ruled by any council. He seeks your life. We must leave now." "Where will we go, Lord Father?" Nahor asked. "We could go north and east to the house of Noah," Abram suggested. "They told me before I left that I and my family are always welcome there." "That is a journey of many leagues," Terah returned, "and through the midst of the wilderness. You may have no scruples about living with Noah in the mountains, Abram, but I do." "Then where shall we go?" Abram asked. "To the cities, hopefully," Lot suggested. "There we will be safe from the dangers in the wilderness." "But what city can we go to that is free of Nimrod?" Nahor asked. "There is one place we may go," Terah stated. "The people there are our kin, though they are estranged from us. They have no love of Nimrod, for they see him and his people as usurpers, even as we in the cities of the plain call them rogues and bandits. We will be safe among them." "What land is this, Lord Father?" Nahor asked. "The land of the Amorites," Terah replied. There was a collective gasp among them. Only Abram seemed undisturbed by this news. "My lord," Eliezer spoke up, "pardon my forwardness, but is it indeed wise to sojourn among the Amorites? We've heard of their exploits in my country of Damascus. They are wild nomads, savage desert people. They have no law but their own, and no gods but their own. And there are worse things than these whispered about the desert folk." "Be silent, slave," Terah dismissed. "When I want your opinion, I will ask for it." "My lord," Nahor interjected, "could we not go somewhere farther? The land of the Amorites is far too close to Nimrod's kingdom." "That is why we go there," Terah replied. "We will hide in plain sight and pray to the Ur-Khaldim that the rumors about the Amorites are true." "But could we not go even farther afield?" Nahor asked. "Somewhere where Nimrod would never find us?" "No," Abram spoke up. All eyes turned to him. "When the earth was divided, the north was given to the house of Japheth, the south was given to the house of Ham, and the middle lands were given to the house of Shem, our people. It would be dishonorable for us to live outside of the lands that were assigned to us." "You speak the truth, my son," Terah nodded grimly. "But more than this, farther afield, either north or south, the people speak strange languages, unknown to any of us. We could not trade with them, nor mingle with them, and they would not do likewise to us. We would be exiles, strangers in a strange land, and may very well be killed. No, it is clear to us now what we must do. We go south, into the land of the Amorites. And we shall go, father, Abram said, as you have requested. The actual packing and preparing took surprisingly less time than they had anticipated. The efficiency of the servants under the strict mastery of the peoples of the East was not to be underestimated. All of them wore hooded cloaks about their bodies. The skirt and off-the-shoulder dresses of the city folk of Ur would do them no good in the desert heat in the land of the Amorites. Abram also had a cloak of goat's hair to hide his face, that he might not be spotted by Nimrod's red cloaks. The sound of commotion came from farther up the city streets. The king's guards were on their way to the house of Terah. They passed through the gates and into the courtyard, searching every corner of the house for the one who was to die for the pleasure of the king. Yet they found him not. The captain of the guard barked out orders, sending half of his company to search the outlying streets and houses, and the other half to begin tearing down the house. If the king's command could not be carried out, then the house of Terah would be destroyed so that they would have no place to return and so be easier to find. Another soldier went, at his personal direction, to the gatehouse to have the city gates closed before they could escape. Yet find them they did not. Once they had decided on which direction to go, they dispersed out of the mansion in groups no larger than 10, each going in a different direction. No sooner had each group passed out of the gates of the city, but they all met up together along the south road. Despite his protests, Abram and Terah were among the first groups to leave the city. Just as the last group was heading out, the order of the red cloak captain came, and the gates were shut. They were never to return to Ur of the Ur-Khaldim ever again. The road they were to take was a long one that would require at least a day's journey. Over 26 miles of arid terrain lay before them and the land of the Amorites. Unlike the northern half of this land, where Noah lived, it became hotter and drier the farther south one went. For most of them, this was much farther than they had ever traveled in all their days. Only 3 of them were more accustomed to this type of travel. Eliezer, for one, had, many years ago, made the journey from his homeland to Ur, a journey almost as long as Abram had made in his return. Terah also was familiar with journeys as long as the one he was now undergoing. His grandfather Serug had established a town southwest of Ur, at the same relative distance as the place they were now going. The story continues in chapter 10.